Well, hello everybody. Today we have an important afternoon. I know that everyone is trying to reach out and connect to this webinar. We're so excited to talk about the RISE program. So we have today our main speaker. He is a faculty member of the PHSU. He's also a scientist and associate director also of the RISE program. So we are very happy to be with Dr. James Porter. Thank you so much for taking of your time to being here with us and to talk a little bit of what the program has to offer. How can we contact the RISE program? How can we reach out to be part of it? And to get to know a little bit who qualifies for the research career training in the RISE program. So Dr. James Porter, I'm going to just let you in so that you can initiate with your presentation. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. And as always, it's always a pleasure to talk about what it's like to be a scientist, about the RISE program and all the interesting career avenues that come with being a scientist. Because a lot of us, I mean, I was just like the students connecting here when I was years ago, but I also didn't know really what I wanted to do. I wasn't sure if I wanted medicine or pharmacy or being a scientist. And let me go to the next slide. So again, this is a little bit about what is the Ponce Health Science University. Obviously, we're most known initially for being a medical school, but then we also have what I'm going to talk about today, the PhD in biomedical sciences. And we also have obviously programs in clinical psychology, public health, and nursing. But again, I'll be talking mostly about biomedical sciences. And since we are the part of the research focus of the Institute, we're also part of what's called the Ponce Research Institute, which is the research side of our university. And what we're most interested in is trying to make a difference in solving healthcare disparities through groundbreaking initiative and relevant research. And really, we're trying to build the gap between what's basic science, like scientists like myself, and in medicine. How can we have a better understanding of what underlies some of the different diseases, and how can we make new and or improved treatments? And so probably most of the people connected here, I'm assuming, don't have any issue with where is Ponce. I'm assuming most of you are from Puerto Rico. Is there anyone not from Puerto Rico on the? And again, you can always you can write in the chat. That's fine. I have the chat open, so I'm aware of what's going on.
So if the participants can write in the chat, if they're from Puerto Rico, we would love to know. Si alguno de los participantes nos puede decir si son de Puerto Rico, se los vamos a agradecer.
¿Y de dónde están, quizás? Mayagüez, okay.
They're from Puerto Rico, yes, and we have one from Mayagüez, Yauco. That's great. So we have a lot of people from the west side of Puerto Rico. That's great. How about the rest of you?
Sí, son tímidos.
Sí, son tímidos.
Pero, y solo otra cosa, si quisiera preguntar algo en español, yo hablo muy bien, estoy aquí ya 22 años, yo llegué en 2000, entonces estoy aquí muchos años, ya yo pasé por el huracán María, los terremotos, ahora COVID, entonces...
Ya a usted se le puede decir que es puertorriqueño, ya está bautizado.
O yo asumo que soy ponceño, no sé. Yo nunca viví en otro sitio a partir de Ponce, entonces.
Bueno, pues sí, ya está diciendo que es de Ponce, pues entonces porque lo lleva bien en la sangre, porque el ponceño es muy orgulloso de ser de Ponce.
Sí, exacto. Ok, voy a seguir. So actually the medical program was founded in 1977, and the PhD was shortly after that in 1988. So the PhD program, biomedical sciences, has been around since '88. And like I said, I arrived here in 2000. So it was already well on its way when I arrived. We have all our accreditation from the different programs. This is for the overall Ponce Health Science University. This is as of year 2020. We had 1,258 active students. And more important for us is the publications. So in research, one of the big aspects that makes research sort of distinct from the other programs is that we have to publish our research. So in that year, or well, I guess in 2019, there are 46 publications coming out of our university. Let's see. So I already mentioned I was going to skip this. So many of you maybe haven't even thought about what is a PhD? What does PhD stand for? And so actually the PH comes from philosophy. So it's like, wait a minute, why do I want a doctor of philosophy? What does that have to do with research? Well, the idea is that the philosophy is the philosophy of how to do science. You know, scientists like myself, we have a certain way of looking at the world. We like to come up with questions. We like to design experiments. We like to generate data, and we like to look at the data and what is the data telling us. So, you know, rather than which happens sometimes too much, rather than just having a gut feeling, this is the answer to a question, scientists like to go through the process of gathering data and seeing what does the data tell us and what is the real answer to the question. Okay. So in general, what are scientists? You know, we're curious. I mean, I was one of those students who always asked questions, would stay after class asking questions. And I wanted to understand, and if something didn't quite make sense to me, I wanted to understand, well, that doesn't make sense. I mean, how can you tell me this and that? Those things don't fit together. And so I think, you know, a lot of scientists, that's what we are. As I mentioned, we're problem solvers. So although I know that in many different careers, you are also problem solvers, but really science is about solving problems. You know, we're creating new data. So one of the big differences between, say, medicine or even probably psychology is that a lot of times the information that's learned is whatever's in a textbook. So textbooks often are, believe it or not, 10 or so years behind the times as far as what's the current data. Because it takes a certain amount of time for new ideas and new concepts to make its way into textbooks and into clinical practice. So often we're at the cutting edge and we're looking at the data that's out there right now and et cetera. We're also critical thinkers, which sort of leads to the last point. We have to be perseverant, because one of the things I always tell the PhD students is we have to get used to being criticized, and we you can't take criticism personal, right? But as scientists, we're critical thinkers, and so that means when you write a paper, when you write a grant, when you present a poster, other scientists are going to be out there and they're going to be, oh, wait a minute, okay, I understand that part, that makes sense, but this part there's something missing, and so that those critiques will come back at you, and you have to just take it as part of the growing process that, okay, maybe I wasn't clear enough, or, oh, maybe I need to do this experiment to answer that question, and then things will make more sense. And so we're critical thinkers, we're innovators, we're also mentors. So obviously I've had a lot of graduate students and undergraduate, even some high school students come through the labs over these last 22 years. And many of them have gone on to either do their PhD or go on to do a postdoc or faculty, or maybe join medical programs. I think I had one who went into dentistry, some that have gone into pharmacy. So, but we're mentors for a lot of different people. And so what do we do? So I've sort of mentioned a little bit about this, right? You have to come up with questions. What's an important thing? What should I do for my research? And although it sounds open-ended, in reality, if you came into a program like ours, you would rotate through different laboratories, and within the laboratory where you felt comfortable and you really felt engaged in the topic, within that laboratory, they have their own research questions. So obviously the people in the lab, the mentor and other students or technicians, they will help you come up with these questions. But once you have these questions, then the idea is you're going to design experiments and strategies to try to answer those questions. And then once you do the experiment, you get the results, you got to analyze the data, and then discuss that results with others, other people in your lab, other people at other universities. As we'll talk a little bit, a lot of times you have to go to meetings, present your data, discuss with other scientists at other universities, even other countries, and trying to sort of make sense of it and what is the best answer to the question you're asking. And so obviously that involves also collaborating with other scientists, training students. Maybe not so much as a student, but even a student, you have to manage to some degree. So I have senior graduate students working with either other more junior graduate students or with like volunteers, undergraduates. And so if they're working on their projects, they've sort of got to manage. So you're learning like people skills and management of a small group of people, right? So these are also skills that you learn, and that helps you as you progress in your career. If you become an academic scientist like myself, I have to manage the laboratory, and that includes writing for funding. So obviously research takes money because you have to buy supplies, you have to pay salaries for, say, technicians, etc. So you're really, in a certain sense, you're running a small business. I mean, you're running a small business within the larger concept of the university. So there's a lot of things you learn as a graduate student. You also travel, which I'll mention in a bit, and clearly you have to write and publish your results, because if you did something in a laboratory but you didn't publish it, it's like you didn't do it. I mean, you can't reach the scientific community who is the one who's going to evaluate your data, the one who's going to appreciate your data, the ones who are going to follow up on what's the next experiment to do in that line of research. So that's very critical. No sé si hay alguna pregunta, o puede escribirlo a chat.
Sí, a nuestro participante, cualquier pregunta la pueden hacer en la sección de Q&A, pueden hacerlo de manera anónima, como también lo pueden hacer con su nombre, como ustedes prefieran. Si no, también pueden escribirnos a través del chat para que entonces podamos ir contestando sus preguntas. Bueno, doctor, yo sí tengo una pregunta. In what line of investigation is your expertise in?
Okay, so so most of my laboratory is working with trying to understand, we work with animals, so we work with what's called preclinical data, the preclinical stage of research. And our research is using animal models that sort of mimic what might lead to diseases such as post-traumatic stress disorder, a little bit with what might lead to depression, things like that. Yeah, I don't have any images or anything like that, but basically we're going through the process of training the animals to be afraid of, in this case, a sound, a tone. And then we're looking at, well, what are the proteins in the brain that are changing that allow that learning to be afraid and then actually the learning to not be afraid. So in a very simple sense, that's what we do in my lab. And we do it from a wide variety of techniques. We do some what's called electrophysiology, which basically is looking at the electrical communication between neurons or the electrical communication between brain areas. We use common techniques now to use viral vectors to actually express a protein, which then can be activated with light. And by doing that, you can look at, well, if I stimulate this brain region, does that affect the behavior of the animal? And so these are all the kinds of techniques that we're using in our laboratory. And right now, I believe I have 4 graduate students, 1 undergraduate who's just leaving to go to do he hasn't made his decision, but he's applying to different graduate programs and he's waiting to decide which one he was going to follow. And then also I have a high school student and who's actually in the lab today, and then 2 technicians. And then obviously we interact with other graduate students as well.
That's very interesting when you mentioned that you have a high school student, right? this program is it's not only in a graduate level, but it also gives opportunities as a volunteer for high school students.
Yes, yeah, yeah. And in fact, if people prepare ahead of time, the NIH, which is the National Institutes of Health, they actually have programs that will actually, they give a little bit of a stipend to the students. So if you apply and you're accepted as a program, the NIH will, the federal government will pay you and to participate in research. But you have to plan ahead. So, if they're high school students or high school students or undergraduate also, if they're interested in research, definitely you can contact us. And then obviously the sooner the better, so they can plan ahead. But many of the students volunteer, and they're not paid, they just volunteer. They help with experiments, they get experience, and then that helps them in their careers.
Thank you for that information, because it's very interesting, really. When you have, sometimes we believe that this opportunity grows in at a graduate level, and it's not like that. You can start since a very early age. If you're very focused and you know that science is your thing and that you like to be on the lab and try to do new discoveries or just participate of that, I love it that Ponce Research and the RISE program has that opportunity here, and moreover here in the South. So it's very accessible for the people in the South region area, and best of all, when we have had these past years a lot of situations, natural disasters that have had a great impact on the education of many kids. So having these opportunities to just keep going on for them, it's great. So thank you for that.
I don't know. I enjoy what I do. I became a scientist because I enjoy it. Okay, let me just continue. So, well, because I think I'm going to skip ahead some of this, but obviously we publish our results, and these are some of our former students. This is actually Dr. Dara Fontanes, who is now our associate dean of our Master's in Medical Sciences program. So she was actually in my laboratory a few years ago, and that's actually her doing some surgery on an animal. And so these pictures are a little, probably should be updated, but these are actual students, and this is a postdoc that was in, I believe, Dr. Flores' lab. And so these are actually some of the things that people are doing. And so that brings me to the point of, if you want to see what we do at Ponce Health Science University, you can go to, I don't know if you guys are familiar with things like PubMed. So this is a website where you can go and you can search through research literature, and you can find what people are doing, or if you have a particular topic you want to look at, you can search there. So this is, I think this was prepared by Dr. Appleyard, but she put in Ponce Health Sciences University, and these are the first papers that came up. But you can see there are like 633 documents that were found there. But the interesting thing, or what people never think about, is that when you're a scientist and you publish your work is there. Your work is always going to be there. It's kind of like if you were an architect and you built a building, that building's there. So after you've retired, or if you've moved on, that building's still there. The same with your publications. So publications are there. They're accessible. Presumably 100 years from now, they'll still be accessible. They might be outdated in 100 years, but they're still accessible. And actually, you can even nowadays with the online metrics, you can actually see how many people are reading your papers, how many people are citing your papers, where are those people citing your work. And it always amazes me that once you publish a paper, how quickly people start reading it. And then as time goes by, they start to cite it in their own manuscripts. So again, you're adding your grain of sand to this thing that is research, and you're helping solve these, in our case, biomedical problems. Obviously for PhD, they have PhDs in other disciplines. In our university, it's in biomedical sciences. but obviously there are PhDs in many different areas. And so then, maybe never thought about it, but okay, if I decide to get a PhD, what would I do in the end? Where would I work? Maybe you're more familiar with, people like myself, academic scientists working at a university, teaching and doing research, but there are many different areas. In fact, many of the people who actually get PhDs do not work in academia. They actually work in areas like industry or government or consulting, science policy, working for the governmental agencies to decide, policies. Obviously, when COVID came out, we had to have people working in science policy to try to make rules and regulations of what makes sense and how can we, combat this, right? And then obviously some of them work in business and finance. You could go on and study law. You could get your MBA. There's many different things you could do after you get your PhD. So it's not just limited to being a scientist working in an academic lab. And unlike many of the medical degrees, so I'll tell you in a second, but I actually am a pharmacist. So I started my training to be a pharmacist. I have my degree, but if I move to another country, I can't be a pharmacist. I'm not licensed to practice in another country, but a PhD is international. So if you get your PhD here, you can go to Japan and you can work as a PhD scientist, because a PhD it's not run by a licensing board, so it's more international. It's accepted all over the place, just like a BS, right? Your Bachelor of Science is probably acceptable in every country. The same with a PhD. And so what does that mean? That means you can also travel. Whoops. I didn't know this had animation. Let me get all the animation.
I believe that's all. Okay. Where they went and traveled.
Yeah, so this is me. So I often tell students that yo soy un jíbaro de Nueva York. Yo soy del campo, un pueblito bien chiquito. And as I was there, I went through the experience of my parents losing their jobs, right? It was a small town. My parents tended to work in something related to farming. Farmers were having issues. This is back in the 80s. And so, I went through the issue of my parents losing their jobs and such. So when I knew I liked science, but I knew I didn't want to do medicine. I had the problem, I would pass out at sight of blood, and I really wasn't my thing to be working with sick people. That was just something I didn't like it, but I did like science. I was always curious. And so I decided to study pharmacy because, again, it was science, and I knew that in the end I would have a guaranteed job. Pharmacy, even back then, you're guaranteed a decent salary and such. So I started my BS. I got my BS, and towards the end, the faculty was saying I wasn't sure I wanted to, working in a local pharmacy. So they said, well, maybe you should consider a PhD. You're always asking us questions, and that's the kind of mentality of a PhD. So I said, okay. So then I applied. I ended up going to University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. I got my PhD there. And then I'd always wanted to be an international student, but I never had the chance, never did it. So by that point, I was already married. And so I asked my wife, well, if I'm going to do a postdoc, what about doing it in Europe? Yeah, let's go to France. So I applied to some jobs in France, ended up going over to Paris, doing a postdoc for a few years. Then I came back, did a brief postdoc in West Virginia. And then that's when, after that, I began as faculty here at the Ponce Health Science University in Ponce, obviously. And that's where I am now. So again, with the PhD, I could go to France, no problem. I could work there as a scientist. And so that's sort of the point. And okay. So I guess most of you are probably already doing your bachelor's degree. So then, what is it going to be if you're going to be a scientist? And so the next step is usually graduate school, which is what we're talking about here. And that's, I always tell my students, you should shoot for about 5 to 6 years. More than that, and you're probably, you're having some issues. You know, you try to focus as much as you can, it's 5 to 6. And as we'll talk later, in most instances, unlike medical school, so medical school, right, it's 4 years, but you're not usually paid to go to medical school. So, you know, one of the advantages of graduate school is most universities have the funds to cover your tuition and apply a stipend. And the RISE program helps with that, especially at the beginning. And I'll talk a little later about that. Then often you do a postdoctoral training, and then after that, you become an investigator. But again, this last point of the pyramid, it's variable. I mean, some people might become faculty right away. Some people might go into industry or into other areas. So that's not hard and written in stone there. There's a lot of variability there. Let's see. So what is our curriculum here? So this is our curriculum. These ones that are in bold, these are our core courses: biochemistry, physiology, microbiology, histology, cell biology, and pharmacology. But in addition, we have all of these other courses, which are, in my personal opinion, many times more important, because the thing about science is that, you know, there's so much information, you can't learn everything. So the more important thing about learning to be your PhD is learning to do science. How do you approach a problem? That's more important. You know, how can I read papers? How can I read a textbook and understand what is going on? So I see someone writing the chat.
How many students are selected for the RISE program? And they are also saying, if they have also an opportunity investigation in a drug design.
Yeah, well, the first question, so how many students? Well, in a total RISE program here, we have 12 students. Each year, it's a total of 12. Some of those students are in their second year, third year, but what we normally try to do is every year to the incoming class, we try to reserve at least 3 spots. You know, a minimum of 3. It sort of depends on the more senior students moving off the program. So as you see here, proposal writing, all of our students have to write a proposal. So all the RISE students have to write a proposal and submit their proposal for an independent fellowship. And we've had great success over the years that many of our students actually are funded. And so what happens is those students, once they get their own independent fellowship, they leave the RISE program, and that opens up a spot for a new student to join the program. And the second question, in the area of drug design, no, unfortunately, right here at our university, we don't have anyone who's really in the area of drug design per se. Yeah, I mean, to do something like that, you might have to select or look at which universities are actually doing drug design. We really don't work in that area of drug design per se.
I believe we're more focused on cancer, on genetics and neuroscience. That's basically a lot of our area, since we work a lot with also health disparities and a lot of community health on communities, and how we can make the at least science work a little bit more on the medical side. So I think we're more population orientated in that kind of sense.
Yeah, although that's not to say that if you were in a lab, you couldn't collaborate with another laboratory that sort of designed new or modified compounds, and you could actually test them here at our university in I don't know, on behavior or on a cellular, like for example, we have a lot of research is looking at cancer and looking at resistance to cancer chemotherapy. So if you're in one of those labs, I could imagine them having collaboration with a lab who actually generates the compounds. And in that sense, there's always opportunities for students to actually go to other labs and learn different techniques. So science is often very collaborative. So there definitely are possibilities. Never say never. But it takes some being proactive and searching out opportunities and contacting people. But yeah. Okay. And let's see. So we have a little bit of, teaching practicum. Obviously, all of our students, all of the students at Ponce Health Science University take the interprofession perspectives and health disparities. We do proposal writing. I mentioned biostatistics is important, ethics, and obviously a lot of writing. I think I'm going to skip this for now. Well, so this is sort of what it looks like year by year. So this has been modified. So now I think it's much more, it allows the students to get into the laboratories much more earlier and gets them involved in their writing a proposal much earlier. And so I think that's what we've been able to reduce the time to graduation from, I think we used to average around 7 years or 6.5. Now we're down to like 5.5 on average. So again, I think that we've done some work on the curriculum and modified it so that it's a little bit quicker, getting the students into the research labs, because in the PhD, the most important things you're going to learn are actually in your research lab, doing your thesis. The classwork, it adds some foundation, but there are a lot of intangible things that you learn while you're in the lab. Like I mentioned, mentoring other students, managing people, writing, communicating, presenting your work, all of those skills. It's not something you can read in a textbook. I mean, sure, you can read in a textbook how to manage people, but if you don't put it into practice, you really don't get the experience. ¿Hay otras preguntas?
At the moment, no, but if any of the participants have a question, this is the moment to do it. You can write it on the chat, or either way, you can use the Q&A section.
Sin miedo.
Pueden hacer sus preguntas también en español, lo pueden escribir en el chat de Q&A, así que sin miedo por ahí, aprovechen esta oportunidad. El RISE Program tiene muchísimo, ¿verdad?, para ofrecerle, así que no se quede con dudas y aclare cada una de ellas.
So again, this is as I mentioned, this is a multidisciplinary research, and it involves new molecules, cells, organisms, and obviously it's designed to be applied to either preventing or treating human diseases. And these are some of the students working on different aspects. As we sort of mentioned already, but our research areas here, the biggest areas are, I guess I would say, like women's health. We have a big lab in endometriosis, and in addition, infectious diseases, which includes both dengue and now COVID, and also a little bit of chikungunya. And initially it was HIV. When I first moved here in 2000, HIV was the big viral disease, but then came dengue, and then came chikungunya, and then came Zika, and then came COVID. So the university does a lot of the researchers here do a very good job at following these infectious diseases, mainly viral infectious diseases. We also have a big group looking at cancer. And in fact, we have a partnership between our researchers here and the Moffitt Cancer Center in Tampa. And so they also often have like collaborative grants and exchange students and exchange residents and everything. So there's a lot of cancer. And in my area is more mental health / neuroscience. So there's, as I mentioned, I'm working with animal models of post-traumatic stress disorder. We have another laboratory looking at the effects of HIV proteins and how that affects learning and memory and behavior. And then we have another lab looking at how cocaine alters the behavior of the animal and how it alters the connections between areas in the brain, and looking at how we can modify and reduce the addictiveness of the cocaine. And then we also have people mainly in cancer, but also looking at genetics of cancer. And then we also have actually the program director of the RISE program here, Dr. Carolyn Appleyard, works on GI pathophysiology, looking at like IBD, irritable bowel disease, etc. Crohn's disease, that sort of thing. And some of the things that we did here in Ponce Health Science University, we were the first one in Puerto Rico to develop this cancer tissue repository. So as part of the cancer consortium or partnership between PHSU and Moffitt Cancer Center is we developed a biobank of tumors. So basically, in collaboration with local physicians in Puerto Rico, when a patient is diagnosed with cancer, if they consent, then they're send samples of the tumor and we store it here frozen, so that the ideas that other scientists who are studying cancer then can compare, what are the genetic differences, what are the protein differences between this cancer and say like a normal tissue. And related to that, also looked at uncovering some of the factors that predispose, in this case, mainly Puerto Rican women to breast cancer. And they're also studied the link between stress and endometriosis. They established the WHO HIV research network in the Caribbean. And then when the COVID pandemic broke out, we were some of the first to set up screening and identifying patients who actually had COVID, and then what are some of the variants that started popping up as the different variants of the COVID started to occur. So some of you might be thinking, well, okay, but what's the topics going to look like? And I agree, again, this may look like some foreign language to most of you, but so you can see that this is just meant to, the first one is looking at, this is from my laboratory, and looking at part of the brain that's important for reducing fear, and looking at how input to another structure was that important. And so now, so he's also a Ponceño. He was born and raised here, Dr. Omar Soler, and now he's working at the National Institutes of Mental Health in I think it's in Maryland. And so he's doing a postdoc over there, doing very well. He got his own fellowship over there through NIH, and he's doing well. And then Mariano Colon is also doing a postdoc, but his research was more related to the endometriosis. Dr. Diaz was working with breast cancer risk. Jocelyn, or Dr. Rivera, was working with HIV. This is one of the proteins expressed by NEF, and looking at how it affects the nervous system. And so as you can see, there's a lot of different topics, and as most of these students have gone on to do very well. So again, I don't want to bore you with it, because I know when I was at your stage and I saw these titles, it looked very difficult, but it's not, trust me. Let's see. And these are just some other. So now how can you prepare? If you decided, well, I really like science, I really want to do a PhD, what are some things that you could do? Well, I mean, obviously some science courses are definitely good. Now the GRE, we probably should get rid of this. Many programs for the PhD have gotten rid of this requirement for the GRE, including ourselves. So now we don't require our students to take the GRE, because we found that it's not a very good predictor of success, right? I mean, the idea with the GRE was, well, if we take the standardized test, we can tell who's going to be a good scientist and who's not. Us and other universities have found out that it's really not very good as far as predicting. So probably for most universities, certainly for us, that's no longer needed. Definitely seek out research opportunities. As I mentioned, you can volunteer in our lab here or other labs, or as I mentioned, you can actually apply for programs and do internships at laboratories in the state. And all of that experience is going to help you, one, decide, do I really want to do this, right? Because I mean, probably the most, I'm actually on the admissions committee of the PhD program, also in the admissions committee MD. And so one of the things that's really important is we want to know, do the students know what they're getting into? Have they gotten that experience? In the case of medicine, have they shadowed the doctor? In the case of PhD, have they worked in a lab? Because if you have never worked in the profession you're thinking about studying, you really maybe don't know what you're getting into. So it's very important to have those opportunities. I mean, it's really important. It really helps you make an informed decision, right? Read science papers. That might be difficult. I know when I was at your stage, so when I was applying to the PhD programs, I tried to read some papers and it was just too much jargon for me. So that is difficult. In science, I mean, English is the language we use in science. So practice English. Spoken for me is not as important as written. I mean, because when you're going to read scientific papers, they're always written in English, almost universally. So definitely learn to read and also to write. So another thing I always tell these students is practice writing, learn writing. Writing is a skill. It's not a skill you can learn in a textbook. You can't memorize it. You just got to do it and work at it. And a lot of times in science and many other careers, if you want to separate out the good students from the great ones, it's often in writing, because it's one of these skills that you just can't memorize. You have to learn it and you have to go through the aches and pains of doing it. And so it's really important, I think. Let's see the time, quarter of. So letters of recommendation, and if you haven't already been told that, they're very important. A lot of times letters of recommendation are really critical. For example, my own experience, so I studied pharmacy and then I was applying to a PhD program. I had no research experience. I had zero. I was in a pharmacy school. We just didn't do research at that time. So my letters of recommendation are key. So, I mean, and in fact, later on, I was speaking to my mentor who actually was on the admissions committee there. And he said, well, when you applied, it was an easy decision. We weren't sure yet, no research, it's kind of a gamble, but, he told me, but your letters of recommendation were outstanding. And he said that the committee really liked that you were on a soccer team and you were the captain of the team. So it's showing leadership. So a lot of these extracurricular, these letters of recommendation become critical, which also means you have to sort of get to know some of your faculty or the people you might ask for recommendations. That's an important thing. And then preparing for when you do get called for interview, prepare. I mean, nowadays there's so much information on the internet, so no one should walk into an interview with no idea what they might ask. And it's good to practice. So a little while ago, someone from the university was applying to actually pharmacy school, and she was very worried about her English. So my wife happens to be a pharmacist. So my wife and I helped the student. We gave her a mock interview in English. We went through, okay, if they ask you this, and okay, what are you going to answer? And I said, well, okay, how about adding this? How about adding that? And just going through that practice is really important. But I think I'm going to jump to the RISE program. So I know. So our students have been very successful, and these are some of the universities or pharmaceutical companies where our previous students who have graduated from our PhD program, where they've gone, what they're doing. So they've gone all over the place, and they've been very successful. So clearly the training they're receiving at our university is top notch, and they can go and make it anywhere. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. So I think they maybe mentioned a little bit about the RISE. So the RISE program really is to help, particularly in the first couple of years of the PhD program, both financially as well as professionally, help the students better adapt and cope with going through the PhD program. So actually what it stands for is Research Initiative for Scientific Enhancement. That's what RISE stands for. And so what they noticed several years now, but they've noticed that, there are a lot of students from what they would call underrepresented groups that, they weren't competing or they weren't completing their PhD, So when you looked at all the PhDs that are given out in the nation in biomedical and behavioral research, and I don't know what the numbers are, but but clearly, like in our population, the number of Hispanic students or African American students who are completing their PhD was not equivalent to the percentage within a population that those different groups are. So they said, well, let's see if we can do something to help encourage more of these underrepresented groups go into the PhD program and actually complete. So the more important thing is completing the PhD, And so that's where this came from. And obviously the idea is that we need diversity in science. And I said, well, why? Why do we need diversity? Well, we need diversity because although I'm a basic scientist, you can also be more of a clinical or a translational scientist. And, they clearly it's quite obvious that if you come from a certain population, you're going to be more likely to want to do research that's going to benefit that population, right? So I guess that's enough for that. So what are our goals, or in science we call them aims, our specific aims? So our goals are to provide trainees, so those are the ones that are accepted to RISE, with continuing enhanced hands-on professional development and research skill training, communication skill training, because again, communication is key. Whether you're a scientist or a doctor or a lawyer, or it doesn't really matter. You're going to have to communicate to the public, and the PhD. I mean, you're sort of at the top of the pyramid. So when you get your PhD, you're going to have to work with the other people who have masters or BS degrees or whatever. You're going to have to provide guidance and training and leadership. So that's because communication is really important. And obviously, along with it, the team building and networking. As I mentioned, often science has to work in teams. Not only within your own laboratory, but maybe between laboratories or within laboratories at a university, etc. So as I mentioned, it's not just classes. A lot of times students going through undergraduate think, oh, it's just classes. No, classes are part of it, but there's so much other skills that you have to learn to be a productive scientist. So as I mentioned, each year we can support 12 trainees, right? And as it says here, 32 of the former RISE trainees have graduated. So far, of the trainees that we've had in the RISE program, 32 have already graduated. And 24 of the former RISE students got their own fellowship, right? And 18 obtained postdoctoral positions, so that's a large number. 8 are currently already in full-time faculty positions, and there were 85 publications with RISE trainees, and 50 of them as a first author. So these are some of the outcomes. This is where all the students have gone. We have 12 right now. 59 were supported overall as of March 2022. 12 are still in our program, right? 6 are graduated from the program that are still in the PhD. Those 6 are supported by like an F31 as an independent fellowship, APS is an independent fellowship, IMBRE is also independent fellowship within the island. And then some are supported by their own labs funds. One decided didn't want to do the PhD and ended up going and getting I forget what this, a Dr. PH. I believe this is in
Doctor in public health.
public health. Okay, thank you.
I know it because I just got accepted today.
Felicidades.
So I'm celebrating today.
So one actually went graduated with a master's from program and did the MD. Three ended up getting the master's degree instead of going all the way to the PhD. And four decided they didn't like it. And one is teaching, one got a PhD in, I believe, I forget, a different program. I don't remember where. One is working in outreach and one is working in industry, but they're all sort of related to science. As I mentioned, 32 have already graduated, 11 postdocs, one's an MD PhD is in his residency program right now. Two have moved, once they got their PhD, then went into the MD program. 5 are working in industry, 2 are lab directors, 8 full-time faculty, 1 patient advocate, and 1 bioinformatician, and 1 is working at NIH. So there's sort of, as you can see, they go all over, right? And so that's also shows the impact of our program here, right? We're not just, it'd be great if we had a only impacted Ponce, but obviously we have a lot more students. We're impacting all around Puerto Rico, all around the US. Okay. This is the program, and I'm not gonna bore you with this, but obviously we have the directorship. Dr. Alpiar is the director, I'm the associate director. We have an external advisory committee, which is these people, these scientists here who sort of help and make recommendations. We also have an institutional internal advisory committee. So we have a lot of people giving us advice, how to work things. Our program director was who you, if you apply to the program, you're probably interact with first, as Jean Marie Smith, which is this woman here. This is actually Dr. Alpiar, this is myself. And we also have a laboratory for molecular and professional development, and that's run by Dr. Leo Torres, and then the technician in the lab is Ivelisse Rivera. And so this is more or less the program. Of course, we have all the faculty as well. These are the students from this year. So although we're not in strict virtual communication right now, but when this was taken, it was during the pandemic. And so we had to do a lot of our activities through Zoom, just like we're doing for this activity, right? And so these are all of the students. And again, as they're saying, they're the face of science. These are young scientists, right? I mean, that's another thing. Sometimes there's a misconception that scientists have are these strange people who work in a lab. And no, I mean, scientists are everyday people, just like all of us. So what does the RISE program provide? Well, clearly it provides, one of the big issues is financial support. So it provides salary as well as tuition, and it provides some money for lab supplies and also for traveling, because as I mentioned, one of the big important aspects and skills that one needs to learn as a scientist is how to communicate and network it with other scientists or the public, right? Not just scientists, and also how to and as well to learn training or techniques. Maybe we don't have everything, we can't have everything in Ponce, but through this program, you can go to another university. For example, Yesenia Rivera is a third-year graduate student in my lab. And so we wanted to use this new technique, but we bought the equipment, but we don't have the experience. So we contacted a scientist working at in Boston, and she contacted him through a friend, and then they set it up. And in January, she went and spent 2 weeks at the laboratory learning this technique, and then she came back, and now we're going to set it up here. So there's a lot of external training. And again, that was paid through the RISE program. We also, a thing that's really important, and even though it's not financial, the students are always interested in the financial aspect, but the mentoring is key. A lot of times when students have issues, they're not sure about something, or maybe there's some family issues, they're not sure what to do, so they need some guidance. So one of the things we set up when we started the RISE program around, I know it started in 2008, so it's been through several cycles. One of the first things we do is mentoring teams. So every student that comes in the RISE program is giving a peer mentor, which means another student is mentoring you. Also a faculty mentor, which initially it's someone from the RISE program, like myself. I have to mentor, I believe I have three of the 12 are my RISE mentees. And so we meet with them twice a semester. Any kind of issues, are there any issues with the classes, any issues with their laboratory, just any kind of issues that come up. The idea is that we can identify the problems early, we can provide solutions and such. So that's a huge aspect that was started in RISE. And I will tell you that all of our PhD programs, students, whether they're on RISE or not, they are all given a mentoring team. We're a small university, so so we work together to implement things we learned in the RISE program, implement it into our whole PhD program. So everyone has a mentoring team now. And obviously there are things for enhanced skills, whether it's a lab course, research workshops, a lot of professional development. We'll have people come in and talk about time management, for example, or how to deal with criticism, or how to apply for a fellowship, or a couple weeks ago, we had someone who's in communication and came in and gave interviews with video camera to the students. And so they had to do their own interviews. So those are other skills. We have a seminar series where we invite, many times they're scientists, but sometimes there's someone working, like I said, communication or whatever. They come in, they give a seminar, and then they have lunch with the students, so the students get to know them more personally and ask them questions. We also have the science retreat. So we had to do it virtually a couple of years, but now I believe this year it's going to be in person again. So normally we go to a hotel here on the island, and we talk about different things. Like I think this year we're going to talk about being an entrepreneur. How could we start our own business, and what kind of skills would you need if you wanted to become an entrepreneur later in your life? And so here's our website. So you can see some of our. We publish a newsletter. I must admit, I can't remember if it's every month or every 2 months. I think it's every 2 months. We publish a newsletter, and so there you can go back and you can see what are some of the things that have been happening. And that newsletter, many of the short articles are written by the actual RISE students. So again, we try to get them writing and presenting as much as we can, because those are skills that are going to be much more useful than trying to memorize the names of these enzymes or something. That's, Google can do that much faster, but being able to present, being able to network, those are skills that you have to practice. And yo creo que this is the ultimate slide. I don't know if there are any questions.
At the moment, there's no questions, but let's see if there's any participants that have a question. Si algún participante tiene una pregunta, pueden aprovechar estos momentos para hacerlo en el chat.
Maybe it wasn't the last question. But there are not too many requirements, but you do have to be, since it's a federal grant, it had to be American citizens or at least a permanent resident. So maybe that's other than that, there's not too many restrictions. And at least what we've done before, So if you're accepted into the PhD program, you're automatically considered for the RISE program. And at least what we've tended to do lately, we tend to try to restrict the number of acceptances to the number of RISE positions we have. I mean, unless we get a year where we have really great applicants, maybe we would accept a student who didn't get into RISE initially, but they may get into RISE shortly. So that's actually what happened with this year. So this year we had 2 spots. We accepted 3 students in the PhD program. 2 went on to RISE immediately. I think a month into the semester, one of our RISE students moved off to RISE into her own fellowship, and so opened a spot, and we gave that to the other student. So I think in the first 3 years of the PhD, I think everyone is covered by the RISE right now, I believe.
Yeah, Nelly said yesterday, earlier in the previous webinar, that it was until the 3rd year.
Mm. And I guess these are the contacts. I guess you could add myself as well. I mean, all of our emails at Ponce Health Science University are all basically our name, first initial, last name, first last name at psm.edu. So this is Carolyn Appleyard. This is Jean Marie Schmidt. Mine would be J Porter at psm.edu. And of course, you can also go through admissions.
We have a question, Dr. Porter, by Rafael Jimenez. Can undergrads apply for research in PHSU for experience?
Definitely, yeah. Yeah, I mean, so we always have undergraduate students who volunteer in the labs. Yeah, all the time.
In order to apply for volunteer at the lab, they just have to write to these emails.
Yeah, I think that would be fine, because I mean we're like we're a small university, so if someone applies, like if someone writes to me and I don't really have a room, then I will send it to usually the Migdalia Cruz, who is the assistant for the dean or the associate dean of the biomedical science PhD program. So I'll send it to her to send it out to all the investigators, because maybe I have room, but maybe someone else does. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that clarification.
You're welcome.
So if any other of the participants have any questions, this is the moment to ask your questions, because we're at the end of this presentation and we're so excited for what we have received today. So thank you so much, Dr. Porter. Definitely great information to take upon on, because I know there's many students that are in undergraduate program in biomedical science, and they're thinking, where am I going to do? What am I going to do? Am I going to apply to a PhD? How can I do it? How can I find some funding to initiate on this career? So thank you so much for that. I'm going to give participants at least a few seconds to see if anybody have questions. If we do not, then we're going to wrap this up and it will be the end of the session. Well, I believe everybody is very clarified on every aspect of your presentation. I want to thank you so much, Dr. Porter, and thank everybody for being here at 2 o'clock and being part of this presentation. Remember, if you have a colleague, if you have a friend, a family member that didn't get to see this presentation, we will be uploading it into the Open House virtual platform. So be free to tell them to register and see the seminars, which are pre-recorded. So thank you, everybody, and thank you, Dr. Porter. This will be the end of the presentation.
Thank you. Buen fin de semana.